This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, something that grows only when no one is looking. For years, we were told the system worked, that rules existed, that enforcement arrived when it was needed. But what if enforcement only arrives after damage spreads? What if accountability doesn't prevent collapse? It only documents it afterward? Because when consequences come all at once, not to one individual, but to an entire structure, that isn't justice catching up. That is a system admitting it waited too long. You've been watching this as a political story. It isn't. It's a stress test. And the system is already bending. If you stay with me, you'll see why timing matters more than guilt here. Why scale changes everything. And why what looks sudden is actually the end of something very old. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because the control you thought existed already slipped. And what replaces it is where this gets dangerous. What actually controls the system right now is not elections, not courts, not even laws. It's inertia. Large systems don't move because they're right. They move because they're heavy. And once they're heavy enough, stopping them becomes more dangerous than letting them continue. For a long time, we believed power lived in visible places. Offices, titles, votes. But real control migrated quietly into structures so complex they became boring, into processes that worked slowly enough to feel safe, until speed returned all at once. Here's the reframing that matters. This isn't about whether rules were broken. It's about what happens when enforcement depends on scale. Small actors are corrected early. Large actors are tolerated until they're not. And when tolerance ends, it doesn't end gently. That's why this feels sudden. It isn't. What you're seeing is the moment a system realizes it lost track of itself. And the next question isn't who did this, it's how long it was allowed to function this way. Because that answer pulls us forward. And it's not comfortable. The most dangerous changes don't arrive loudly. They arrive gradually. So gradually that people stop noticing they're happening. There was a time when complexity raised suspicion, when opaque structures triggered scrutiny, when size itself invited oversight. That time passed quietly. What replaced it was normalization, layer by layer, exception by exception. What once looked like a warning sign became a business model. What once demanded explanation became routine paperwork. And what once required trust began operating without it. Before irregularities were interruptions, now they're absorbed, processed, filed. The system learned to live with them. And that's the shift that matters. Not a law changed, not a rule removed, but a tolerance recalibrated. Slow change is harder to fight because it never asks permission. It doesn't announce itself. It just adjusts expectations until enforcement feels optional and delay feels reasonable. Until suddenly, delay is no longer possible. And when correction finally comes, it arrives not as a fix, but as a shock, which is why what happens next doesn't feel like reform. It feels like impact, and that impact is already forming. Then, in a single morning, the quiet broke. Not gradually, not procedurally, all at once. Multiple locations, coordinated movement. Doors opened in places that had never expected it. Volume mattered more than drama. Boxes, devices, records measured not in pages, but in weight. People who had spent decades operating in private were suddenly processed in public. Not one, not two, an entire layer. This wasn't precision. It was saturation. Observers reached for familiar comparisons, but those comparisons missed the point, because this wasn't about spectacle. It was about signaling. When enforcement arrives this way, it's not looking for a single answer. It's creating pressure across a system, many nodes, many vulnerabilities. And here's the detail that should make you pause. This wasn't unexpected. It was withheld, built quietly, timed deliberately. If this were about one violation, it wouldn't look like this. So stay with me, because the scale of the response tells us something unsettling about what was found. And what it implies is larger than the shock itself. Here's how systems like this actually work. Not through a single decision, not through one dramatic act. They work through distribution. Risk is fragmented. Responsibility is diluted. Benefit is concentrated. At the center, a small group gains stability, access, protection. Around them, layers absorb friction. Accountants, lawyers, executives. Structures designed not to deceive outright, but to exhaust scrutiny. Each layer can claim ignorance. Each step can appear compliant in isolation. No one part looks catastrophic on its own. That's the design. When value is extracted, it moves upward. When exposure appears, it moves outward. When accountability arrives, it hits the perimeter first. The people closest to the center don't fall immediately. They wait, they watch, they measure loyalty against survival. And enforcement understands this. That's why pressure is applied broadly, not surgically. Because the goal isn't a verdict. It's imbalance. Once the structure loses equilibrium, cooperation becomes rational. Silence becomes expensive, and from there, the system doesn't collapse suddenly. It leaks. And leaks always accelerate. Now the system speeds up, not because anyone wants it to, because it has to. Once pressure spreads, timing becomes unstable. Decisions that could wait no longer can. Silence becomes a liability. Phones stop ringing. Messages move off official channels. Conversations shrink. People begin counting days, then hours. What was once abstract exposure becomes personal risk. Careers, families, freedom. This is where structures fail fastest. Not from outside force, but from internal calculation. Everyone is told the same thing. Hold steady, stay aligned. But alignment erodes when consequences are uneven, when some faces appear calm while others absorb the cost. And enforcement doesn't need to rush. It only needs to wait, because fear accelerates disclosure. And disclosure never arrives evenly. It arrives asymmetrically, one cooperation agreement, then another. Each one reframes the risk for everyone else. That's the moment systems dread most. When control fragments, and once fragmentation starts, no amount of loyalty restores it. What follows isn't chaos yet. It's something colder, a race. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because systems like this don't collapse in courtrooms first. They collapse in lives. You feel it when institutions hesitate, when decisions slow, when certainty disappears, when markets flinch, your costs rise quietly. Credit tightens, jobs pause, promises become conditional. You're told this has nothing to do with you, that it's isolated, contained. It never is. Because when large actors are allowed to operate without consequence for years, the correction never stays local. It redistributes damage downward. You pay through volatility, through instability disguised as transition, through rules rewritten after risk has already been taken. This is the part that's hardest to see while it's happening, because no one announces it. If you want to understand where this leads, you have to keep watching before it's framed for you, before the story hardens, because what's coming next doesn't stay personal. It spreads. This is the moment it stops being domestic. Because systems like this don't respect borders. They rely on them. Money moves faster where oversight doesn't follow. Structures multiply where jurisdiction fragments. What looks local from the outside is already international underneath. When enforcement begins tracing paths outward, it triggers reactions elsewhere. Banks reassess. Governments review exposure. Institutions quietly distance themselves. Not publicly, strategically. Risk doesn't need to be proven to be priced in. It only needs to be plausible. And once plausibility exists, trust recalibrates globally. Credit terms change. Relationships cool. Silence replaces partnership. This is how financial contagion actually starts. Not with panic, with caution, The problem is that caution compounds. One review triggers another. One withdrawal invites more. By the time anyone uses the word crisis, the system has already adjusted around it. That's why what's happening now matters beyond any single country. It's not being announced. It's being modeled. And the models don't agree on how this ends. From here, there are only 3 directions this can move. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The system absorbs the shock. Rules tighten quietly. Some actors fall. Others adapt. Life continues, slightly narrower than before. The second is erosion. Delays stack. Confidence thins. Enforcement becomes selective again, not by law, but by fatigue. The lesson learned is not accountability, but endurance. And then there is rupture. That's when timelines collide. Legal processes meet political power. Markets react faster than courts can move. Decisions are made to preserve stability, not integrity. Rupture doesn't arrive as collapse. It arrives as exception, special handling, temporary measures that don't expire. The danger isn't which path is chosen. It's that none of them restore what was assumed before. Once a system shows it can drift this far without correction, every future actor adjusts behavior accordingly. That's the acceleration phase. Not more violations, more calculation. And once calculation replaces trust, the system doesn't break. It hardens, and that brings us to the end. Not a conclusion, a warning. What matters now isn't how this case ends. It's what the system has already revealed about itself, that it can tolerate drift for years, that it can delay correction until scale makes damage unavoidable. That accountability, when it finally arrives, comes as shock instead of safeguard. That should unsettle you, because the lesson being taught right now isn't just to those under scrutiny. It's being watched by everyone else with enough power to matter. They're learning what works, how long you can stretch complexity before it snaps, how much risk can be externalized before it's noticed, how late enforcement really is. Nothing about this guarantees reform. Nothing about this ensures restraint next time. And the most dangerous outcome isn't collapse. It's normalization, a future where this becomes the expected cycle, not the exception. If you want to understand what follows, you have to stay engaged before the story is simplified, before it's resolved into winners and losers, before the system declares itself fixed. It isn't. This was a signal, not an ending. If you want to see where the next pressure point forms, stay with me, because what comes after this won't announce itself either. And missing it will feel a lot like safety, right up until it doesn't.